Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a pretty incredible collection of stuff to dig into today, all about language, I guess, and how it, shapes how we think and act. Some Hayakawa in there, a few wild anecdotes. Oh, and even some poetry, which always makes me a little nervous. But hey, that's
Yeah.
why we have an expert, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We kind of take language for granted, like it's just
I'm
there.
sure.
But it really is the basis for how we make sense of the world,
Yeah.
how we connect, how we even mislead ourselves sometimes.
Okay, so you're saying it's not just about talking, it's about how we think. That's kind of a big deal when you put it that way.
Right. So Hayakawa, he talks about this gap between like the actual world out there and then the world of words we carry around in our heads. And sometimes those two things match up great, but often, well, they clash in some pretty surprising ways.
Isn't that the whole point of poetry, though? Like, using words to create a feeling, an image even, that maybe doesn't literally exist, but you still get it.
Exactly. Think about that line, the hunched camels of the night trouble the bright and silver waters of the moon. I mean, nobody's literally seeing camel-shaped shadows in the moonlight, right? But those words, they evoke a whole mood, a feeling of mystery, stillness. That's effective language at work, going beyond just reporting facts.
But that also means words can be used to make us feel things that maybe, well, maybe aren't totally rational, right? Isn't that how advertising works?
You're hitting on a key point there. Hayakawa says even educated people, we can fall into this trap of thinking like savages when it comes to words.
Yeah.
We react to a word as if it is the thing itself.
Oh, man. Okay, now I'm thinking about those ads for, like, fancy bottled water. They're not really selling hydration. They're selling this image, this feeling of purity and luxury, all these words like crisp and pristine, and suddenly I feel bad drinking tap water.
See? That's exactly it. It's that story Hayakawa tells about the woman who thinks scientists, just because they can point a telescope at a star, they know the names of all of them. We mix up the label with the actual reality.
So, am I just gullible then for falling for that? Not everyone gets tricked by words this easily, right?
Well, Hayakawa's point is that we all do it to some extent. It's like built into how our brains work. He calls it intentional orientation. We get so fixated on the words themselves that we lose sight of the actual facts.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better, at least. But if this is so basic to how humans think, are we like stuck? Can't just rewire our brains, can we?
Maybe not rewire completely, but we can become more aware of these traps. One example Hayakawa uses is this story of two towns, both facing unemployment. One town calls it relief, focusing on dependence. The other calls it social insurance, emphasizing community.
And the social insurance town ends up doing way better, right? Even though they're dealing with the same situation, it's just the words they use that make the difference.
That's the point. Words aren't neutral. They carry this baggage with them, emotions, judgments, even if we don't realize it. It's like those political debates where everyone's arguing about freedom or justice, but nobody actually says what they mean by those words.
Ugh, yes. It's just noise until you get down to specifics. So how do we become less savage in our thinking then? Is there like a step-by-step guide to not being manipulated by words?
Well, Hayakawa gives us this cool tool called the abstraction ladder. It's a way to visualize how we form concepts and hopefully avoid confusion.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How's this ladder thing work exactly? Give me the basics before I climb too high and fall off.
Imagine you're looking at a cow, right? Like a specific cow standing in a field. That's the most concrete level. Then you use the word cow to refer to it. But you can also use cow to talk about all cows in general, which is more abstract. You can even go higher livestock or farm assets and so on.
So each step up is like zooming out, seeing the bigger picture, but losing some of those nitty-gritty details.
Exactly. The danger is getting stuck at those high levels of abstraction. We end up arguing about capitalism or socialism without ever agreeing on what those words mean in a concrete way.
It's like those arguments online that go nowhere. Lots of big words, no real-world connection. How do I, the listener, actually use this abstraction ladder in my daily life? It can't just be for, philosophy debates.
That's where it gets really interesting. Next time, we'll look at how even simple word choices can lead to prejudice, and how this two-valued thinking traps us into seeing everything as black and white.
Ooh, getting a little dark there. All right, well, I'm ready to climb down a few rungs and get into the details. Let's do this.
So we were talking about, how words can sometimes trick us into thinking we know more than we do. Turns out this can have some pretty serious consequences when you think about it, especially with prejudice.
Whoa, okay. Prejudice. That's a pretty heavy topic. How does that connect back to what we were just talking about?
Well, Hayakawa, he uses this really powerful example of the word Jew. He points out how some people react to that word with all these, like, negative assumptions, even if they've never met a Jewish person in their life.
It's like they think the word itself, tells them everything they need to know, which is obviously ridiculous.
Right. And it all comes back to that confusion between the word and the actual reality. We forget that these labels are just like shorthand, a way to categorize. They don't actually capture how complex people are.
So it's not that words themselves are bad, it's how we use them, right?
Mhm.
Like I can say I'm going to the bank and it means something totally different if I'm talking about a riverbank or a place to deposit money.
That's a great analogy. Context is everything. But when we get stuck in that intentional orientation, we lose sight of the context. And
Yeah.
then we start treating these labels like they're the whole story.
It's like we're back to those primitive tribes Hayakawa talks about.
Yeah.
The ones who divide the world into Gogo and Gigi based on like totally random stuff.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking, that's where all the trouble starts. You start seeing the world as us versus them, and then it's really easy to, demonize the other.
Okay, so prejudice is bad. We get it. But how do we actually fight against it? Is it just about being more careful with our words?
That's definitely part of it. But there's also a deeper level to this. Hayakawa talks about this thing called the two-valued orientation, which is basically seeing everything as black and white, good versus bad.
But isn't that how a lot of people think? Like, isn't it natural to want to say things are either right or wrong?
It might feel natural, yeah. But it can also be incredibly limiting. It oversimplifies really complex issues,
Hmm.
and it ignores all the nuances, all those shades of gray that exist in reality.
There's that saying, right? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Perfect way to put it. When we're stuck in that two-valued thinking, we're basically trying to, like, pound square pegs into round holes. You force everything to fit into your categories, and you miss out on all the complexity, all the beauty of the world.
So what's the alternative? How do we get out of this two-valued trap?
Ayakawa suggests something he calls multi-valued thinking. It's a way of approaching the world that acknowledges, that there are multiple perspectives, multiple truths even, multiple ways of seeing things.
So instead of just black and white, we're adding in all the colors of the rainbow.
Exactly. It's about being open to new information, questioning your assumptions, being willing to see things from other points of view, even ones you might disagree with.
Okay, but isn't that kind of exhausting? I mean, do I have to consider every single viewpoint on every single issue?
It's not about, being paralyzed by indecision. It's about being more thoughtful, more nuanced, more open-minded, I guess.
So it's less about having all the answers and more about being okay with not knowing everything.
You got it. It's about embracing curiosity, humility, and a willingness to learn, to grow.
I like the sound of that. It feels a lot less stressful than trying to, force everything into these neat little boxes.
Yeah.
But how does this multi-valued thinking actually work in real life? Give me an example.
Think about those political debates we were talking about before. Instead of getting caught up in all the slogans and the rhetoric, we could try to actually understand the values, the concerns behind each side.
So instead of just yelling liberal or conservative at each other, we try to have an actual conversation.
Exactly. It's about listening with empathy, trying to understand where the other person is coming from, and finding common ground even when you disagree.
Okay, that sounds a lot more productive and honestly a lot less frustrating. But isn't that way easier said than done?
It definitely takes effort
Yeah.
and practice, but the payoff, it's huge. When we can break free from that two-valued trap, we open ourselves up to a whole new world of understanding, connection, possibility even.
Are you saying that just by changing how we think about words, we can actually change the world?
That's a great question. It leads us to Hayakawa's idea about reading for sanity. He says engaging with lots of different sources, different perspectives, it can help us be more grounded in reality, less susceptible to, being manipulated.
So it's not just about being careful with our own words, it's about being critical of the words we see out there in the world.
Exactly. We need those critical thinking skills to navigate this, deluge of information these days. All the misinformation, disinformation.
Hmm.
It's a lot.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's not just about avoiding being a jerk with our words. It's about using language as this tool for understanding, for connection, maybe even making the world a little better.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing the power of language, for good and bad, and choosing to use it wisely.
This has been a lot to process. I feel like I need a minute to let it all sink in. What else do we have to cover in this last part of the deep dive?
Well, we still need to tie some of these ideas about language back to those misleading directives and talk about the importance of context.
Sounds good. Let's take a moment to gather our thoughts, and then we'll come back for the final stretch of this fascinating exploration. Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were talking about how even simple words can, like, fuel prejudice and all that, too valued thinking. Kind of a bummer, honestly.
It can be, yeah. Especially when you see how language gets used to, manipulate and divide
Mm.
people. But remember, understanding those traps, that's the first step towards breaking free.
Right, awareness is key. But what about those sneaky directives we talked about? Those commands or suggestions even that try to get us to do things.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to tell when you're being manipulated, is it?
That's the tricky part. Hayo talks about how directive language often has these hidden promises attached.
Hmm.
And those promises, well, let's just say they're not always accurate.
It's like those weight loss ads that promise you'll be like beach body right in just a few weeks. I've fallen for that one a time or two. Spoiler alert. It doesn't really work that way.
Yeah. Exactly. Or those political campaigns that promise to fix everything with one simple solution. They tap into our desire for, like, easy answers. But the world is rarely that simple, is it?
It's like those clickbait headlines you see online. They're designed to get you to click. Right. Big promise, but then the article is a total letdown.
Perfect analogy. It's about getting us to react emotionally, to bypass that critical thinking part of our brains and just go along with it.
So how do we protect ourselves from being led astray? It feels like these traps are, like, everywhere.
It all comes back to that scientific attitude Hayakawa keeps talking about. Don't just accept things at face value. You got to question those assumptions. Look for actual evidence.
You mean like how scientists are always testing their theories? They don't just assume they're right. They actually try to, like, prove themselves wrong. That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
It might seem that way, but it's the foundation of progress. Being willing to change your mind when you get new evidence, that's a sign of strength, not weakness.
So it's not about being stubborn, holding on to our beliefs no matter what. It's about being open to new information, even if it challenges us.
Exactly. It's about humility, being curious, and being committed to the truth, even when even when it's uncomfortable.
Okay, yeah, I can get behind that. But sometimes it feels like there's so much noise out there, it's hard to even know where to start. How do we, like, filter all this information and figure out what's actually true?
That's where context becomes super important. You can't just look at words on their own, You got to consider the source, the speaker's intentions, the historical background, all of it.
It's like that whole thing about fake news, right? It's not always about outright lies. It's about twisting the truth, taking things out of context.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to develop those media literacy skills, to be able to, really evaluate the information we see and hear.
So it's like being a detective. You got to gather clues, look for inconsistencies, piece the whole story together before you decide what's what.
I love that. That's exactly it. It's about being engaged, actively involved in figuring out meaning, not just passively taking in information.
Wow, this has been a trip. I feel like we've gone from feeling totally overwhelmed by language to, like, actually having some tools to use it better. What a relief.
And remember, this is a process. There's always more to learn, more to explore. The power of words is a pretty huge topic.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into language and thought. We've explored how words can, enlighten and deceive, connect and divide. But ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide how we use this incredible tool. So next time you come across a powerful statement or even just a catchy slogan, take a moment to step back, climb down that abstraction ladder. Ask yourself, what are the facts here? And how are these words trying to shape my thinking, my actions? Keep those critical thinking skills sharp, stay curious, and keep exploring the world of language. Who knows what you might discover?